Welcome to this dialogue between two of the finest minds in their fields. Welcome students and faculty, and the Vice Chancellor and others. My name is Ashwin Tombert. I am a journalist. I am not an academic. I will conduct this session. This is a dialogue between Professor Amit Bhaduri and Professor Madhav Gadgil. They will each make a presentation, then probably they will talk about each other's points, and then we will take questions. I will first introduce the two guests. Professor Madhav Gadgil, I think, is a very, very well-known name in Goa also, not least for the report on the Western Ghats, which today is under extreme stress because a highly diluted version of it is coming up against opposition. Um, Professor Gadgil he did his MSc in zoology in Mumbai, and then since then he has did his PhD at Harvard and has been a lecturer at Harvard, at Berkeley, at Stanford, at the Indian Institute of Science, has been on the Science Advisory Council to the Prime Minister of India, chaired the Science and Technology Advisory Panel for the Global Environment Facility, has published more than 225 scientific papers, written 6 books in English and 2 in Marathi, and has been one of the foremost guiding voices for a sane look at environment as opposed to development, or as in conjunction with development. Professor Amit Bhaduri was educated at Presidency College in Calcutta, at the MIT, and at Cambridge, where he did his PhD. He has since he has taught at various places around the world, including Presidency College, IIM Calcutta, D School, JNU, where he is Professor Emeritus, Center for Development Studies at Trivandrum. He has taught in Mexico, at Stanford, at Vienna, in Norway, and in Germany. He is attached to the Pavia University in northern Italy, and both of them, as you know, are visiting faculty visiting professors in Goa. Professor Bhaduri has also written 6 books, and he, though as he is an economist, he has also raised his voice on increasing inequality, on development as it stands in India today, not benefiting its poorest people. He's also raised his voice against repression on movements of people, as in Singur, and against the Kudankulam nuclear plant. And we hope that we will have an excellent dialogue today. Professor Gadgil.
Thank you. I deeply appreciate this opportunity to be here, and of course, it's been a great pleasure to get to know Professor Bhaduri, whose work I was earlier familiar with, but personally, and we have been having serious conversations over several days. So I think one of the things which will happen here from these conversations is very clear, that you are going to be disappointed, because yesterday a journalist came and he said, well, you are ecologists and you say these things, and now Professor Bhaduri will of course attack you, as an economist. So this is not going to happen, because I think this contradiction which is posed between environment and development, even our chair maybe said environment versus development in this remarks. This versus, I think, is a false contradiction, and I hope as we go along it will be clarified. And certainly Professor Bhaduri is a distinguished economist, will undoubtedly from his perspective say why he thinks it is not a contradiction at all. But there are ways in which you can view these two fields, ecology, economics. These distinctions between ecology and economics are artificial, that one should think of the broader picture. and that one, when one has broader a view of the broader picture and one has certain values in common, and I know that I and he certainly have many values in common, which are perhaps very old human values. And what I would briefly like to talk about is, as a biologist and as a student of evolution as well as ecology, genesis of some of these values that both of us seem to hold in common. Now, in human evolution, there is a debate. What is it that has made human species, which is today maybe just one of the million species of living organisms on Earth, so dominant on Earth? And the answer is that we have elaborated what has been called the cognitive niche, that humans are the only species which have, with our very powerful symbolic language, developed the ability to elaborate a large system of knowledge. What are the main modules in our brain? There is interesting neurobiological and other studies, and we talk about 4 modules. There is the language module, which is very highly developed in humans compared to our primate ancestors. The second module of which people talk about is the ecological module, that this knowledge is used, and for a long time humans had to have intimate interaction with their natural world. We are maybe as a species 150,000 years old, and the modern, in some sense, divorce from the natural world is barely few thousand years old. So for a very long time, we had to deal with the natural world, and we talk about the module in the brain, the ecological module, which developed organized knowledge about our food, our predators, our natural setting, which then was used effectively for human enterprise. The third module is technological module, that animals do make some tools, but humans are incredibly better at making tools. And of course, the way this world has been shaped today is by technology generating a whole range of artifacts, man-made artifacts. So there is the technological module. And the fourth module is the social interaction related module. Humans are also a species where you have, in some sense, the most elaborated array of social interactions which is possible. So you have all sorts of social animals, beginning with, say, honeybees, but in those, the social interactions are limited and genetically programmed. Humans have the ability, amongst other things, because of our language and intellectual abilities and, of course, the social interaction, to recognize each other individually. And perhaps keep in mind identity of very, very large number of individuals, and our history of interacting with them. And a very important paper in the evolution of social behavior, which is one of the fields of my interest, is entitled Evolution of Reciprocal Altruism, that humans' social behavior is grounded in mutual aid, in reciprocal interactions. But those reciprocal interactions can also be not fair, not positive. Of course, humans, in the elaboration of knowledge also, humans are not only able to develop a very valid objective set of knowledge, but humans are great liars. Humans are able to develop falsehoods, come up with propositions which really are not objectively valid at all, and in many ways use them to manipulate other human beings. And in this network of reciprocity, there is not only fair exchange of aid to each other, but there is also a lot of freeloading cheating that you do for others what really is not in fair return. Let me take one extreme example. We employ, well, we elect maybe politicians, and people are expecting them that we have elected them, we have done something for them, voted them, they will do something for us in return. Amongst other things, when the elections are on, they make a lot of promises as to what people want. After the elections have concluded, they many times we have this experience, go completely back on those promises, and instead of aiding those who voted them, aid those for whom they have said they will in fact take some negative action because they have been hurting people's interests. In Goa, I don't want to mention specific examples, but everybody is telling me that this has been constant experience, including recent experience, of cheating, of not reciprocating for the votes, in this case, given to them, of lying and doing things which people least expected to happen. So this is how humanity works. Now, in terms of further human evolution, there are two important aspects. One is this elaboration of knowledge and objectively valid knowledge, which is certainly much of natural science knowledge. The natural sciences have developed a system of verifying facts. A distinguished scientist whom I greatly admire, J.D. Bernal, has said that science is a organized enterprise of skepticism. So science has the system of continually, in an open democratic fashion, examining all propositions and then verifying whether those propositions are valid or not. And because of that, science has progressed tremendously, especially when it is dealing with simple systems, physical systems, chemical systems. So you have very good knowledge of physics, chemistry, processes at those levels. Technology is based on that, and technology is effective enough that our Chandrayaan can actually land on the moon. And so this is all grounded in valid objective knowledge. These technologies have enabled us to create artifacts, enormous number of artifacts, and the world today is dominating, maybe in many parts of the world, by buildings rather than by natural vegetation or whatever natural biological life. And the buildings themselves bring up other things. For example, the current incredible building spree over much of the India has also generated demand for large-scale quarrying of stone, mining of sand, which then has major impacts on systems which are not necessarily in the really built-up area. So all of this has meant that there has been a great differentiation within the human groups. From an ecological perspective, we talk of this differentiation in terms of people who are still largely dependent for their livelihoods and health on natural world, and people who are completely independent of their dependence on the natural world, who are in a position to bring in resources they want from wherever they are available, and therefore have a very different relationship with the other people and with the world at large, the natural world at large. The terms which have been proposed by ecologist Dasman are ecosystem people, people who are dependent on the natural world for many of the things they get. So take a very simple example, water. In a lot of areas of Goa, there are natural springs coming from the plateaus, the sadas, and there is a tremendous dependence on those natural springs for domestic water supply, for agriculture, horticulture, and so on. Now, in the artificial world, creation of the artificial world, those plateaus are also where there are iron manganese deposits, and they are being mined, and these water resources are being adversely affected. So those who are getting benefited from that mining, they are not dependent on those water sources at all, and for them it does not matter. Those who are dependent on them, they are in a way like what Dasman called these ecosystem people. They are being hurt very, sometimes very seriously. However, there has become, and I don't want to go on, just quickly I will try to conclude what Amit and I have been also talking about. In the economy that has been elaborated, these ecosystem people are what we would call in the unorganized sector of the economy. And those who take advantage, let's say, of the mining in this context, are in much more in the organized sector of the economy. In India, Amit tells me that maybe 10% of the people have their livelihoods dependent on the organized sector. 90% of the people are dependent on unorganized sector, and not that all of these 90% have heavy dependence on natural resources, but a very substantial portion. Maybe 65, 70% at least have very substantial dependence on natural resources. The organized sector would like to project that development is what they mean, which is creation of more and more buildings, and therefore more and more stone quarries, and therefore more and more sand mining. And this is all for the good of the society. That they would also like to contend that poverty is being eradicated through all these buildings and all these stone quarries and sand mining. These seem to be propositions which we have discussed. I think, therefore, there is this contradiction to say that what those who are in charge, in control of technology, in control of money, and who benefit from all the various activities, primarily of man-made creations, they would want to project development in one way. You should then really carefully examine what is development. To my mind, that is not what development should be. If you look at in Indian languages, maybe in Konkani also, Vikas must be a word being used. So you look up what is Vikas, what is the earliest use of Vikas. It turns out in Jain philosophy, more than 2000 years ago, the word Vikas is used. And it is said, it says that world is going on its cycles. There is Vikas, Unnati, and downflow, Adhogati. When the general store of happiness in the society is on the increase, that is Unnati or Vikas. When the general store of happiness in the society is on the decline, then it is Avanati, Adhogati, opposite of Vikas. So if one should think of these kind of issues and not equate simple growth in artificial production, which is reflected in certain ways in growth in GDP, as the basic measure of development, in which case, if you think of the welfare of the larger people, the welfare of the larger people, I think, very much resides in maintenance of the natural world in a healthy state, in preservation of the livelihoods of the people which are dependent on the natural world in a healthy state, their physical health, their mental health and social harmony is also dependent in a good state. That will be development, in which case ecology and economics will not be contradictory. If you accept this definition, if you only think of development as more and more buildings and stone quarries and sand mining and more higher and higher rate of GDP growth, then of course there is a contradiction. But as I said, Amit and I have been talking now for a long time, and I think he would, as an economist, talk about this. I don't think this is an honest, genuine contradiction. It is part of misleading people. I will close with one remark, maybe provocative, which is that when you deal with simple systems like physics, chemistry, as I was said, then it is very easy to verify what are the objective facts and thereby also build on them and build technologies. When you come to complex systems like economics, the systems are so complex, very difficult to clearly specify and understand what is happening. So there is tremendous scope for lying. You have this famous statement, there are lies, damn lies and statistics. Maybe there are statistics and economics. So let us, the economist who posit a contradiction from between development and environment, to my mind, are in that category of damn liars. Thank you.
Well, let me speak on behalf of not the damn liars, but somewhere starting from there. I think I would like to start from a point which is slightly different but similar to what Madhav Gadgil said, which concerns the what is this confusion between development and ecology and growth and so on and so forth. You know, one of the most influential philosophers of the 20th century, and whose thing continues almost in all philosophy departments everywhere, is Wittgenstein. And one of the things which actually, a simple idea which made a lot of difference to use of logic, was what he called the use of language to extend, to spread truths, to spread good information, bad information, and so on. Wittgenstein had many examples in his later works, which were actually called language games. And a language game is a game which you play in a particular context, just like you play chess, so on and so forth. And a typical example he gave is you are building a building, because he said so much about artifacts and so on. You are constructing a building, and at the top of the building, somebody is standing and dropping bricks, and somebody at the bottom of who is just catching the brick. So the man at the top just keeps on saying brick. So by which he means the whole sentence, catch the brick. And the man at the bottom understands it after a few days, and then after some time he even does not say here the brick, he only uses one small words and so on. So this way you can actually evolve a language in many ways, and this is the simple example. But if you think about it, I would not go into logic, but if you think about it in a very simple way, this is what much of the confusion of development is about. Development is a language game. Because development is a language game not only because people say it as a lie or as a falsehood, deliberately very often, but it is also something which is just like the brick falling, it is in the context. And in the context, all of us here, living in the cities or in near cities and so on, they'll develop a certain notion of what development is, just like we develop a notion of what language is. And that notion of development is what Madhav described with a lot of use of science, technology, and so on, and quite rightly so, to make life easier and so on. And we say that is development, and the more of it is more development. And this is a language game, partly deliberately played by people, and partly not deliberately played, but fooled by other people getting fooled in the process. Now, this notion of development as a language game, I do not want to take the view that, my view is exactly the correct one and so on. But the first point to discuss what is development versus what is ecology and so on is to realize precisely this. That development being a language game, there is nothing called the model of development. That there is just one way of developing, the way America or England or even ancient India developed and so on and so forth, is really the way we should go about it. Start from there. Now, there, if we start from it, and I think where we agreed on a much more practical level, that you can make a broad classification between development, which are much more, I will say, I do not like using the word, but which is normally used from journalists to everybody else, people-oriented. In Delhi nowadays we call Aam Aadmi-oriented. But this is that people-oriented development versus the development which is, again to use a simpler word, big business or corporate-oriented. Now, the notion of a corporate-oriented development, which is one kind of playing the language game, is something which is far more widespread because it is, well, you know, because they, to a large extent, they influence the media, they influence the way people talk about, you know, development, the way journalists represent development, the way they represent, you know, Gujarat had so much of growth, somebody else did not have growth, so on and so forth. All this is, you must remember, is within a paradigm of a development which very largely is done by one kind of perspective of development, which is, for a shorthand I'm using, a corporate or business, or big business oriented development. As opposed to this, there is always this sort of poor man's view of development, to which I think I largely belong, and one of the very few, I think, economists who has been systematically saying this for a long time, which is of what does it mean that if you want to contrast it with something else, which is people-oriented development, compared to, you know, what you see every day in the TV and so on and so forth, newspaper. I think one of the simplest criteria, concrete criteria of knowing, rather than using just words, is to see whether that development is actually benefiting the people. Well, what does that mean? It simply means that whether it is, to some extent, it is allowing people to have their livelihoods or to their employments to continue and expand. Rather than, you know, rather than looking at GDP growth, you simply look at what is happening to the livelihood and employment situation of the country. And if you look at it, there is a, you know, there is a very famous but true story about an Latin American dictator in the late 60s, who went to America to the US president, at that time US president, this is recorded, went to the US president and said, well, he was a kind of puppet dictator, sir, I have something to report to you about my country. He said, yes. He said, you know, my country is really having wonderful development, growth and so on. Only people are not doing so well. You could say that about India today. And I think this is something which I want to elaborate on a little bit. That if people are doing well in terms of, or doing better than before, in terms of the fact that you have people, and to some extent both their income and livelihood is increasing, you can use this as a criterion of development. Now, this will basically mean that you should, this has a very simple but very important implication, and which goes against virtually everything that you normally hear or read in sort of journalistic literature or learned economists emanating from World Bank, IMF, Indian Finance Ministry, or what have you. And that is, if you look at it in a very, very simple way, that it is people-centric development and it is employment-oriented, the statistics would immediately tell you something is grossly wrong with this country. It is not only 90% of the population are in the unorganized sector and so on and so forth, but simply, some of you may not know, that by the government's own statistics, since, for example, the beginning of the liberalization, I just have to take something. You know, during the period when India was going much more slowly, the so-called Nehru times and so on and so forth, if you look at the older times, India was growing at 3.5%, 4% rate of growth, much lower than. Our employment was growing at 2%. And much of the middle class was created then. If you look at India today, and China, these two high-performing economies until very recently, both of them employment grew at, in China, 1.1% by official statistics, in India, 0.9%, less than 1%. And in the corporate sector, it did not grow at all. In the high-paid corporate sector, it did not grow. Output grew, but employment did not grow. Output grew because of the fact that output per worker grew because of mechanization and so on, but employment did not grow. I don't want to go into the economics and so on anymore. But this is a very simple criterion. This is what all citizens can use, and they can use it everywhere. And use it everywhere, not only about state, not only about damn lies and statistics, but simply use it in your own locality to see whether livelihood and employment has increased or not. This is what, and this is where my personal complete change and what did you say? Organized skepticism. My skepticism about organized knowledge of economics, which is a subject which I studied and made a living on, began to grow when I traveled. Well, I'm putting it a bit dramatically, but actually when I traveled in many parts of India, including Odisha, including Chhattisgarh, Jharkhand, the so-called, much of the, so-called, extremist affected areas of mining and so on and so forth, I began to see, Gadgil in Maharashtra, on the border. In all these areas, there is one uniform pattern, and forget about the politics. And the pattern is the attempt to do mining on a large enough scale actually destroyed people. I could tell you fantastic stories which I have myself come across. But this is where I began to see that something was not grossly not correct. And it was not just by a law and order problem that you can deal with it, or you should try to deal with it. You must look at how employment is actually being generated or destroyed. Livelihoods are being generated or destroyed. And this is where I think our meeting point at a concrete level as two rather, apparently different academic disciplines completely merge. Because I think you really cannot improve livelihoods in India and simple employments in India unless being more careful about your environment. I'm not taking the usual view of an ecologist or anything else that, we should maintain our ecology, it should not be destroyed and so on. Not at all. Forget about all that. Think in a very simple way that if you want to employ, if you want to develop the livelihood of ordinary people, how would you do it? If you put anybody who has some idea of different parts of India, that if you destroy the environment very rapidly, would you be able to do what you are doing? The statistics exist to some extent. They're based on particular field surveys and so on. But one thing comes out very clearly. If you look at areas like, say, Odisha, the areas I talked about, the poorer parts of India, Goa is not a part of it, but the poorer parts of India, if you look at it, you will find something very, very surprising, that something like 30 to 50% of people's income and livelihood comes actually from what is called their common property resources. The river, the mountain, the forest, the leftover grains from the harvest, everything together, the common property on which, animals are grazed, these together actually account for anywhere between 30 to 50%, depending on the area. The poorer the area, the more, depend on this kind of common property resources. And what development does, the first target of growth is and has been, from the time industrialization started in England, and certainly much more viciously now in India. I mean, much more viciously, because they had, very soon ideas of going out and conquering and imperialism and so on. But in the Indian case, it has turned internal. Internal colonialism, if I can use a rather dramatic expression. But this is what it does, because basically it is the same kind of colonization which you do of the local people, by saying, you have no right to live, and what is more important, you have no right to participate even in the modern life right now. And this is one of economist bluffs, or what is called damn lies. Because what happens is, somebody who is a, let's say, simple Dalit or tribal or whatever it is, largely gets his income from these areas. You tell him or her that, well, just wait for 5 years or 3 years and you'd be better off. We'll get you. I mean, quite apart from he mentioned Singur, but a much better example is Vedanta, which has been, Orissa, where much more documents are there. But how does somebody live for 3 years? How does somebody who is speaking only one tribal language and is divided by the tribal language from anybody else, cannot even get a domestic worker's job? How do they manage to live for 3 years? I mean, this was asked to me through an interpreter. Actually, this was asked to me when I became aware of it, in Dantewada by somebody, and he is not a Maoist, I know it, who was looking for a job. The same question in a different way was asked to me when we were in the POSCO area. That people who are uprooted, they ask that, how do we live? Because you would not give a job to somebody with whom you cannot even speak properly, at home, leave alone other things. And this is what started not only migration, but this is where people put their back to the wall and fight, that we would not allow this to happen. Now, it's a bit of a digression, but this is what development actually, what high growth has basically meant, and I'm arguing for something which can be put in one sentence now, which is to say that you place much more emphasis on employment and livelihood preservation, and for this you have to preserve your common resources, and growth would be the outcome of this. I tried to do some calculation in a book when people challenge me and so on, some of the people from the government and so on. And actually it shows that if you actually can do this, if you can create employment, move towards full employment and so on, you can most probably quite easily go to 5 to 6% growth, but much more decentralized, spread out. And this is what we are saying. We don't need a 10%, which will only be for a few. And if it is 6% very widely spread out, you will see much more what he calls the upper side of happiness. That is so far as the growth development debate is concerned. Now you see, if you focus on the livelihood of people and so on, then there is one question which is very simple, but which even trained economists have to ask themselves, and which corporations have to ask themselves also. Anybody has to ask themselves. That you see, in a modern society, you also produce not only for yourself, but also for what is called the market. You have to produce in a certain way to sell so that other people, you can get it through exchange and so on, right? Now, this means in economist jargon that there should be a demand to absorb what you are producing. One of the reasons why things like employment guarantee scheme and many of them, governments, hundreds of schemes, do not work, because apart from being made by bureaucrats without any idea, apart from that, it is not something where you are able to say that what output will be produced out of this and what will, I will produce infrastructure, will produce roads and so on. After 2 years, it might get washed out, but nothing which you can do. The only way in which a complex country like India, you can get to this, producing things which will partly solve the demand problem, and partly it will be with participation of the people, that is their employment and their livelihood. I cannot think of another way, but simply to have an extensive participation through local level, decentralization. That what projects you do, how you manage to develop them, whether they will sell, whether people want a hospital, a school, or a theater building for that matter, this should be decided by the local people within limits. You should have a mechanism by which whether they coordinate or go together should be there. But this has to be much more. Today it exists on paper, There are 90 amendments 93 and 94, and the 5th schedule and all that, that exists on the constitution level, at the level of law, but nowhere it is absorbed. When in areas, when with some lawyers and journalist friends, we went to an area in Chhattisgarh, and we said that we want to check, not check, I mean, we had no status, we were just citizens. We want to see actually whether what you are doing. The CRPF, which is supposed to maintain law and order in that Naxal-infested areas nearby and so on, they turned their, literally they turned their, I was in the first car, unfortunately. They turned their rifles on us and said, we will shoot unless you go back from here. Nobody is allowed to enter here. This was a land which belonged to the Tatars. I mean, I don't know whether it belonged to the Tatars or something like that, but it was simply that on the main road we were told to turn back. This was one of the richest, some of my geologist friends tell me that it's known to be one of the richest and closest to the surface, that is, you have to do very shallow mining, richest iron ores in the whole of the country. There's a place called Lohandiguda. Now, you see, it is this kind of thing by force that you do to stop local people to get in. And there are hundreds of stories, documented stories, not stories, documented evidence of where you are supposed to ask the local panchayat. I am told, I don't know whether this is true, that this is much, much less true. In Goa is the only and a glorious exception to this rule. That's what I have been told. Huh? Right. It is not, okay. I mean, the communities, are they not?
No, there is now a move to scuttle the community.
Okay, we'll talk about it later. Yeah, but rest of India actually, which talks about a greater degree of participation, actually looks to Goa. And this is not just what I am saying, this is what I have been given the impression of, even by people who sort of travel around and are social activists of various sorts and so on. One of the, they say that this is the area you should look for better participation by communities. I mean, it simply doesn't exist in some areas, but even they say that in Goa it exists. Anyway, I'm too new and too unfamiliar, and I don't speak the language, unfortunately. So for me to directly find out without interpreter, but I will. If I come here, I will certainly find out for myself. In other parts I have seen and so on. Now this is what is the most important thing we should try to do. That is, we should not simply say that, these are the kind of things which local people can produce, and therefore that's it. Let them produce it and we'll see whether. We should actually try to see to what extent they produce, and to some such extent that there is a local demand for this. And this brings me to my last point, and why I said that development is a language game. And this is the part where it is of daily importance to all of us. You see, we say that there is a great development because such a long bridge was built. There is great development because such a large airport was, international airport, air conditioned was built and so on. These are, he said, symbolic language. Language is these are symbols of a kind of development which is of a particular type. But I think what we really need to look at is, as I said, employment and so on. But equally important for this is to see that the goods they produce, what you call the structure of the goods which are produced, the types of goods which are produced, they actually get a locally sellable market. I mean, there are many important, and this need not be handicraft. And this has a very important economic implication. I cannot elaborate, but I can briefly indicate and stop. Structure of output, if it is a more locally produced, domestic market-oriented structure of output rather than international, automatically it tends to be, we have studies, first, much less natural resource intensive. I mean, to have the same cup of coffee in a mall or in a 5-star hotel, the amount of energy which you indirectly spend, and that is something which economists have learned to calculate, one of the famous economists in Harvard, originally a Russian, did this first. But you can indirectly also calculate by what is called an inverted Leontief matrix. But I will not go into this. You can calculate to a rough extent what is the indirect input which is needed, the energy needed to produce a cup of coffee in a mall as opposed to producing a cup of coffee in a street side place. Now, it is true that for many reasons and in many places you want to have malls where you want to have a coffee and so on. But that will not produce development in India. I mean, inequality and everything else apart. Employment based on dhaba-based food, to put it very crudely, local use of local resources, and some of it can be much more nicer than, I mean, I can tell it from a contrasting experience of both than usual 5-star hotel food. You can easily have, and this will create employment and this will produce a structure of output which will be far less natural resource intensive. And the most important in this is what is started with, that the biggest gobbler of natural resources, the biggest, what is a black hole, where you have no ending to the use of or sucking in of natural resources, is urbanization. The more you tend to make your employment based on urbanization, the more and more it will be an impossible problem, even from the supply side, to solve. You would not have the natural resources. We know this from, you know, that Gandhi's famous statement that there is, England requires the whole planet, whole of the country for its industrialization. How would India industrialize? You may or may not agree with that, but that industrialization, the kind of natural resources intensity it will have, I think virtually we would not have not only an ecological future, but we'll just not have a future. And that is why we should actually think of a kind of development. I don't have to give what is my particular likes and dislikes. We have to think of a kind of development. All of us have to think of a kind of development where the structure of demand of the is such that it is a much simpler. That is the meaning of the word austerity. It is not a moral word. It's a word which is actually what is feasible economics and practical politics. Thank you.
We would keep the floor open for questions. I would like to ask Professor Bhaduri one question in the meanwhile. You see, you were talking about levels of inequality and concentrations of wealth and things like that. Are we at a historical sort of high where that is concerned? I mean, see, for example, compared to the old feudal times when you had kings who had very, very lavish these things and peasants who were very, very poor. There have been recent reports that, for example, that the lowest 3.5 billion people in the world have just about as much assets as the top 3,500 or so. So are we at very historically high levels of inequality in the world?
I think when he says historical, he really means historical. That is not a time series in the normal sense of an economist. In a historical sense, I think we do have statistics now, however good, bad, from literary sources, from others, by a famous, what is he, Swiss economist, economic historian. And what I can gather from about the time of Akbar and a little bit earlier, medieval India and a little bit earlier, it was very much like that. India was quite a rich country, but the poor were very poor, very badly distributed. But Europe was even not only poor, but the income distribution was even worse. The European feudalism, particularly the East European feudalism, if you want to know a little bit of the details. East European feudalism had the worst, according to available statistics, the worst distribution of income. Now, we did not have the technical measures of income inequality like Gini coefficient and so on and so forth. But what we know for sure from historical, semi-historical accounts and roughly that kind of narratives is that, much of the resources were common property resources, which is connected to this. So even if you were very poor, you caught the fish, you got something from the field, you grazed animals about which, even around Delhi, which people did not stop you from doing, and so on. So the poor had a much freer access to nature. And, a big part of the nature was for their indirectly supporting their livelihood. Nature was also killing them, because tigers used to roam, or wild animals used to roam around, but at the same time, it provided natural resources. You see, with industrialization, with so-called civilization, this gradually died down. So, at least one group of historians, Europe's Black Death, the famous Black Death onwards, and the recurrence of pesticides and so on, it was very largely connected with this change in the, agricultural cultivation and so on. But I think if I have to answer your question, if you take only income measure, and that is also true in India, that how much is your income, you will probably find it was very bad income distribution, though we have no data in this. But you must also remember that there was the unaccounted for income or consumption, which was based on nature at that time.
Professor Gadgil, if the sort of effort is for everybody in the world to come to the levels of the developed countries, is that sustainable given our total planet resources?
No, I am not a person qualified to answer this question. I do not. It would appear not, but as I said, unlike Amit, he will give you statistics and explain. I am not competent technically to answer this question.
Okay, we have our first question, so let me ask the first question. This is a question to Professor Bhaduri. At present, when political parties are looking for populist policies, do you think that the solutions which you suggested could be acceptable to them?
I am no longer a young person. And at least for the last 20 years, I have been trying with different parties, including the communist parties, then part of what they call the left-wing Congress socialists, to today Aam Aadmi Party, that don't talk in the air about, development, poor people and so on. Tell what you can do in terms of employment, in terms of livelihood of people. And one of the things which I still have not given up talking about, employment guarantee I have given up talking about because for whatever reason, what turned out to be. But one of the things which I still haven't given up, and this is something I think particularly for the younger people, it's a very good starting point to think of environment and development. That the land acquisition, and the new land acquisition bill, so on and so forth, whether around the city or in the countryside and so on, which is probably going to be outside the political parties, the biggest eruption point in India, if it really happens. One of the simplest things is to take the view that land acquisition should not take place unless equivalent amount of livelihood is created. I would not go into the numbers, but I think, roughly when you do, it is 1 to 3. 3 livelihoods, all India, the little bit of casual statistics I have done because no data exists. But roughly 3 livelihoods are destroyed for even the simplest kind of one employment, wage labor employment in the cities. In Singur, it was 4 to 1. In POSCO, it was more than 5 to 1, So you have very many cases like this. And this is something which, unless the corporations or the people who are taking this over, people's resistance, you should start by saying that, there should be no employment taken. And this is also true of Aam Aadmi Party, Delhi, and on a practical, very practical level, one line. I think the only way they can do it in big cities, in all big cities in India, where actually this kind of political movement is sprouting, The only way they can do it is to put a lot of emphasis on self-employment. Not only in agriculture, but whether it is cycle rickshaw, whether it is taxis, whatever it is, that is the crux. And that is the biggest employment generating sector in the... Well, so far as they are concerned, so far, you asked, the new parties and so on, they have not done very much. I am not even sure. I know the Delhi group very well. I don't think they have even thought about it. Thank you, so far. They have thought about election, but not about what they would do if they have power, like everybody else.
This question is to Professor Gadgil. In the process of development, many rules and laws are framed to protect the environment, but what we see today is that the same rules are violated by the same lawmakers and administrations. How does one tackle a problem like this?
Yes, you mentioned also our Western Ghat Ecology Expert Panel report. One of the main reasons, I guess, for its unpopularity amongst powers that be is that we have given very concrete, specific examples of how laws and democratic institutions are being violated. There is a chemical industry complex at a place called Lote in Ratnagiri district, just north of Goa, where the pollution levels are well beyond limits set by the Water Act. But this pollution has been going on for 20 years. No action is taken. Huge amount of fish deaths, massive deaths take place from time to time. The fishermen contend that while 11,000 jobs have been created in the chemical industry, 20,000 fishermen have lost their livelihoods. Anyway, so the Pollution Control Board, what has it done? Earlier, its office was at Lote. There were such frequent complaints that they moved it 40 kilometers away. Now the fishermen desperately, from time to time, take out demonstrations, peacefully protesting whenever there is a large fish kill. What does the collector do? I have found, and I have recorded this in our Western Ghat Ecology Expert Panel's report, the following statistics. Of 600 days of which record was available in collector's office, on 181 days people took out protests against water pollutions. On 180 days, the collector promulgated some section 144 or whatever to suppress those demonstrations. So it is very clear that both the laws are not being obeyed. The Pollution Control Board is certainly not doing its job, and the law and order machinery is acting perversely.
Thank you. I'm going to put three questions together for you. The first question is, you touched on the difference between the mall economy and the dhaba economy. Says now that India has embarked on the mall economy since 1991, is this reversible? If not, is there a way to make mall economics more people-centric? There are two other questions. One talks about that contrary to the ideal capitalist economy, we have to have an alternate model of a progressive economy, etc. And one of these is the cooperative sector. And the third question talks about, as an alternative, Gandhian economics. Maybe you can sort of answer all three together. So.
Well, when you give a 20-minute talk, you tend to, have the character of a cartoon. So, to some extent, I think when I said the mall versus the dhaba economy, it was like a bit of a cartoon, and I'm glad it went through, to make the analogy clear. I think what I meant by the dhaba economy to a certain extent is what I said at the end rather casually. That you see self-employment, and I would not go into the statistics of this, what is called self-employment in the sense that people more or less either have their own, little bit of saving or borrow from the bank a little bit, and at a very simple level set up something to make a living. In the urban areas in India today, I think if you really want to create employment in the urban metropolises and so on, you have to give much more emphasis to this. just like you will have to give much more emphasis for the national economy to the domestic rather than the external sector in the name of globalization, you have to give much more emphasis to the domestic sector. And within the domestic sector, you can go down. In the villages, it will be much more local domestic economy, local economy. In the cities, it has to be a vast penumbra of people who live in the cities and today provide us services with the threat of law and order. Their houses are everywhere. Their houses are, much more in Delhi, Bombay, Calcutta, all these places. A little bit less in Chennai. But actually, compared to that, I think what we should try to do, and I'm going more towards my particular idea, but I think this is something which is to be thought about, that how can we improve self-employment and make it a little bit more productive and so on. Now, it is in this connection that I come to the next question, and I think I'll be able to sum up them together. What is ideal capitalism? Just like, I'm not a philosopher, but the Plato, one of the prominent Greek philosophers and the beginner, created this rather, if you like, language trap, that of the ideal type. You have the ideal circle. So all circles which you see in the world are variations on this, but there is an ideal, somewhere, and which is in relation to which you should judge that. Actually, that's one of the things which is attacked by this kind of Wittgensteinian stuff. But this idea of an ideal capitalism is exactly its opposite is ideal socialism. They tried it in Soviet Union, but that was too state bureaucratic socialism. They tried it in China, but they could not do it because it was too totalitarian. The fact is, you should go the other way around in all these things. That is what exists, from where, how much more can you get? The most important thing of a capitalist economy in our time, including in India, mall economy or otherwise, is something which once I say it is very simple, but until I say it, probably would not have seen it. That is, you see, it's at least much more due after the liberalization, but something from the period of, I think, Rajiv Gandhi. But anyway, forget about the historical periodicity. There is something which is very simple but very invisible which happened, and increasing more and more, and Manmohan Singh became a past master at it, quite deliberately. And that is, you see, you give something called investment incentive. That is, you give the capitalists, in a capitalist system, the capitalists get certain kinds of incentives. Now, whether it is successful or unsuccessful, Singapore and so on give tax holidays, they give accelerated depreciation, they use their geopolitics to a certain extent to further their causes. So different ways you can give in terms of taxes, fiscal policies, lump sum grants. You can give it to the poor also, like you can make, water free, you can do this free, you can do it for the capitalists also. And you can say for equality, I'm doing one or the other, I'm doing the one or the other because the country will grow faster and so on. What happened in India, and if you look at it, you see, we did not have a vast market, domestic market, because there were too many poor people. It's a huge country, huge number of people, but only about, I would say, maximum about 10-15% could buy the mall economy stuff. So maximum 20%, and that to localize in the cities. So how do you maintain the investment incentive for the ideal capitalist system to develop, whatever that means, for the capitalism to develop in this country? The way which they did, partly consciously, partly for reasons of corruption, partly for reasons of collecting party funds. Those are issues. But the way it was done was to give virtually free natural resources. You see, if you want to look at it in a bigger picture, as whether it is with mining, or it is with, coastline, or it is with mountains, or it is with forest, all of them are linked with this, creating the incentive for the capitalist class. That is, you take land and land-related natural resources, using the government's using the state's prerogative, the eminent domain or its later version and so on, that I'll acquire the land at a certain price, and then you give it over to the corporations. This is almost invariably true, And this is how India did it. This is how China did it, of the two recent examples. Earlier, when democracy was less developed in other countries, England and so on did it less. But this is what is that attempt to develop ideal capitalism at home for a country like India has meant. And when I say that we do not want that way of developing, it is that incentive structure for the capitalist, which is not only inequality, which is not only the kind of tremendous inequality of wealth, but much more the inequality which is being generated every day almost, in the name of sales, in the name of, that the government will take up the natural resources and give it at a very, very simple price. That is what the problem is. What has happened to some extent is reversible. I cannot go into the detailed cases now, but to some extent is reversible. But even if it is not reversible in many cases, I'm not saying you burn down all the factories, but you need not create more factories. That would be enough. Thank you.
Supplement. Many years ago, the Karnataka government asked me to look at paper industry and its impact. Amongst the examples I discovered was that in neighboring Kerala, EMS Nambudripad, this must be in the 60s, had given essentially free bamboo resources to a Birla Rayon factory. In Karnataka, I have the data. The paper factories were given bamboo at 1.5 rupee per ton. At the same time, on the market, the basket weavers were buying bamboo at 1,500 rupee a ton. But Kerala, you had an interesting twist. People complained that, communist Nambudripad, how can he be doing this? And his answer is being quoted even today. His answer was that this will intensify class struggle. So in the long run, it will bring what we want. That is why I am giving it. And interestingly, just a few months ago, when we had a discussion with a number of basically CPM workers about our Western Ghat panel, this was actually quoted. He said, your recommendations, it will reduce class struggle. So they are bad recommendations. You want to continue Nambudripad way, giving away natural resources to whatever capitalists, so that class struggle will go on intensifying. So, there are very interesting.
I think it's a bit on a personal note, but I would like to say something. I taught for 1 year in Kerala, in the Institute of Development Studies or something. And I used to live with a friend who was a very famous, probably India's most famous economist at the time, Ken Raj. And Nambudripad used to come there very often in the evening. I think it was Achyuta Menon who became the chief minister at that. But even when Nambudripad, several times, because I was living there in the evening, it would get into a debate. Now it has become a caricature in places like Bengal with Buddhadev Bhattacharya and all these people, their idea. Nambudripad was an intelligent man. There is no doubt of all the communist leaders, he was the only one who could think much more about this set of issues. And this was his bluff, like the Muslim League, and why caste coalition will further class coalition, and so on and so forth. I would not go into his theories, but what was very interesting is I repeatedly noticed among my friends, and I don't know whether this exists here, that not only there is no difference about the notion of what should be the path of development, but they believe that more industries, the better. This is as much true today. I mean, if you talk to today's communists, it was not only, the best among them might say that yes, it was not good to have so much of corruption through the government and so on, if you point it out. But they still believe industrialization, polluting the environment, and so on and so forth, not only is the only right path to development, because Soviet Union did it or China did it, or China is doing it. And if you go to East Europe, you will see, I was there last year, if you go to East Europe, you will see the amount of damage which has been done to the environment. I'm not a great environmentalist, but the amount of damage which has been done to the environment is considerably more than in capitalist countries. Only in Russia it has not happened because it's a much larger country and so on. Yes. I wanted to say also a word about the third question. I thought I was going. Just 1 minute, can I say? You asked me about Gandhian economics and, his little bit about the class struggle, furthering the class struggle was a particularly welcome addition. You see, the good thing, I mean, on the one hand, I think at least in India, the traditional notion of doing it whatever you call it, the Soviet kind of industrialization or the China kind of industrialization, because of partly ideological, but partly because of very good reasons, people have seen its weakness to some extent. I mean, you can discuss it much more. You can discuss, because you asked me about cooperatives and so on, much less freely about Gandhism in this country. But first, Gandhi made tremendous amount of compromises at that time, and they're documented 46, 45, 1 year before his death, 45, 46, and so on. But I'm talking of particular incident about concession to Birla, who was certainly not a local producer. I could give you the quite horrific example, and exactly what you are saying. The local water getting polluted, people made repeated representations, and he sort of ignored, something. He said something about change of heart and so on and so forth. But, in actual terms, did very little. Now, I think, because you pitch maybe because I'm not much of an idealist, because you pitch your level so high about change of heart and so on and so forth, it becomes unattainable. And similarly with the communists, we'll produce the, socialist man and so on, and you end up by producing a Brezhnev at the best. Now, this is not really what you are looking for. You are looking for I repeat, you are looking for development and ecology here and now, and not in an idealist way, not in a utopian way. You are looking for something with which we can start. And where I have not said about cooperatives, I think, if they naturally evolve, they're good. And when they naturally do not evolve, they can be atrocious, like the sugar thing in Maharashtra. Now, what is really important is, I said the language game. It's important to remember that with cooperative, with any of these social organizations of production, if you like, with any of these things, it is very important to know development is your staged process. I do not know what India's development should be 20 years from now or 30 years from now, if actually the things which I'm saying today, self-employment and so on, whether it should be the right policy 30 years later. But today, when you have so many poor people, when you have, if I'm honest, intellectually honest, today these are the pressing problems, and this is the way in which you can go ahead. Again, to quote a philosopher rather than an economist, there is something which is, that falsification and verification of scientific principles. Karl Popper, he had a very beautiful thing at the end, after all this logic and so on, which he called the, what simply we call the compulsion of our time, what he called the logic of the situation. And he said that, I am a Jew, I am born, I can see Hitler coming, originally a German, Hungarian. He said, what do you expect me to do? And I heard it also in the autobiography of a famous historian, Erich Hobsbawm, that, Austrian Jew Hitler coming to power. I know what Stalin was, but what do you expect me to do in 1930? The logic of the situation demands something. And I think you should, to a certain extent, rather than being, I believe in non-violence, or I believe in violence, I believe in modernization through industrialization, rather than giving these kind of grand slogans, which very soon will turn out, or I believe in a corruption-free India today, rather than giving these grand slogans which very soon will turn out to be unattainable at that level, I think you must think of it in stages, simpler problems in mathematicians on algorithms in which you can solve by small steps the problem. And what I suggest as development today, employment focus and so on, is our problem here now today. I don't give a damn what people say, what people say in, as development in Harvard or in Cambridge or, anywhere else. This is our problem. We have to solve it our way. And the logic of the situation is the way which must guide us.
Thank you. This next question, I think, could go out to both of you because we have a defender of urbanization here. It says urbanization does have its positives. There's a common means of commuting, housing, etc. Don't you think that the model of urbanization needs some care and change through a justified use of resources, green buildings, recycling of water, etc., rather than saying that's a bad thing?
No, I mean, again, I don't think, it also said that urbanization per se is whatever, bad, and that you must, well, we have this story, I guess Cambodia, where they tried to, Pol Pot, tried to destroy all learned professions and cities and send everybody back to farms. But that is not at all the issue. Issue is in detail exactly how urbanization should be proceeding. In that, Amit also said about kind of employment that may be created in these urban conglomerations. There are issues of why people are flocking to the cities. If it is that their livelihoods are being destroyed in their natural habitats and thereby they are being forced to go to the cities, then that is an issue. I personally have done some studies. We have these Dhangars here in Goa, but on Dhangars in Maharashtra, the Kolhapur and all these districts, their traditional grazing-based livelihoods have been destroyed by common property resources being taken away from them. And what are they forced to do today? They say we have no other employment that we know of other than selling bananas in Mumbai. And it is a horrible life. We don't like to live in Mumbai in slums and sell bananas. We were very happy in the forest here with our buffaloes. So if that is what urbanization is doing, no, these are the kind of issues. I don't think we are saying that urbanization is something and we are going to want to say that there shall be no cities or no urban areas.
Well, two small additions to this comment. One, I agree, but two small additions to this comment. While we have to be very careful about what pushes people out of their natural habitats and so on, there are two things of the cities which already exist in urban areas, and I think which we can do and which we probably, citizens are becoming more aware, at least some of them. I think the first thing is, just like common property resources in the villages or distant areas, or forest areas and so on, in a less dramatic way but more important way, there are common property resources in the cities also, like your footpaths. Have you ever thought of footpath as a common property resource? Or halfway to a common property resource like bicycling, like in Holland and so on. I mean, they did it by, I don't know, whatever reasons. But like it would be so much easier rather than building so many of highways and so many of flyovers, if you could only for motor cars so that they can speed up. If you did have this kind of common property resources for common people. And I think this is one thing we should think about and we should try to do whenever it is possible in certain areas. I mean, Goa being a rather dispersed area in terms of broken up in different localities and so on to some extent. But if you go to Maharashtra, if you go to other areas, you'd immediately see that what I'm saying, how much difference it would make to self-employments and so on, and more decent life and so on. This is one very important thing which politicians don't think of. And it is not only the dramatic things about, how the poor people. And the second is, which in some areas have been tried quite successfully. And I think in Chennai, they say they're trying it in some areas. You see, women have a tremendously hard time because they not only have to make a livelihood in whatever way they can, plus they have to, traditionally, they are the one who cook the food in the family, almost all over India and so on. Now, in most other places, you have very cheap canteen food or very cheap roadside food and so on. They are trying this in places like, not they're trying this, but in some particular areas in Chennai, and I'm told in 2 areas in Hyderabad, they're trying. Now, these are extremely beneficial to very, very poor women and reducing their burden. And this you can only do in urban areas for various reasons. This is the kind of, again, not the language game, but the kind of a different way of seeing the urban problems, which I think is quite important. At least to be aware that these things can be done. And this is also a problem of an urban area, in addition to, garbage clearance and the usual things people talk about. That we must know what are the common property resources and how it affects the poor. Thank you.
Just one supplementary fact which my friends in Kerala are telling me, where there is this very serious issue about stone quarries which are very negatively affecting many people's livelihoods in the Western Ghats of Kerala. They said, where does the stone quarries, what do they supply? Construction in Kerala. What is the outcome of all these burgeoning urban constructions? Apparently, there are 11,000 flats which are lying vacant in Kerala, of the more high-price flats, and I don't know, some 13 lakh people don't have pakka houses. So there is this issue. In the locality where I stay in Pune, which happens to also be a locality which is favored by people with money, 80% of the flats are lying vacant. People have constructed and bought them. Yeah, I'm sure in Goa also, as speculation. Now, as speculation, and or many of them are United States or somewhere else, and they just want to have a flat or a bungalow in this favored locality. The question is that kind of urban growth, which if it is at the cost, like in Kerala, I'm sure in Goa, in Maharashtra also, on outskirts of Pune, there are serious problems with these stone quarries. Is that the kind of urbanization which we should be thinking about, or there is other ways of thinking about that?
Yeah, this question is for Professor Gadgil. I'm sure that you can add something. It says, you spoke of people who are not dependent on the natural world. Do you think that there really exists such a category, or is this just a language game that imagines a category of people who are independent of natural resources? No, there's a corollary to that. How can we justify that development is for the population of people who are poor? And how can we have a balance between development and ecology where the demands of people are increasing day by day?
First, well, of course, in a sense, we all breathe air, and so people are dependent on natural resources. But certainly, there are a large number of people who I also personally know who are very much divorced from the natural world. This locality I was staying in, where I was talking about in Pune, it has fortunately very nice hills next door. And you can go for exercise on the hills, and I enjoy that. Most of my friends and young people, they are staying in buildings there. They do not even walk down from the 3rd floor. They go always by the elevator. Then they get into their cars, which are air conditioned. They drive 7 kilometers, go to a gym, and there they walk on the, again, energy consuming treadmills for half an hour and come back. And in that time, without any of this petroleum or electricity being consumed, I go up to the top of the hill and really enjoy. Actually, there are a lot of peafowl there and a very nice place, but they simply don't venture there. So there are people who are sitting in their air-conditioned cocoons in their houses. They are sitting in the air-conditioned cocoons in their cars, and they are doing their exercise in the air-conditioned cocoons of gyms. They are people who are largely divorced from the natural world, and there is substantial number nowadays. As to how we can have development when population is growing and all these issues, now these are broader issues which Amit also talked about. It's a question of what kind of demands by whom, in what way we can accept. For example, near Pune, I am sure you have similar examples. In Lavasa, there is a city on the bank of a dam. The water is meant for supplying Pune city and agriculture to the east of Pune city. There, for construction of that dam, land was taken over from people, many of whom have been rendered homeless. Lot of that land did not go underwater. It was not returned to those people. It was given to this Lavasa township and villas for the rich to enjoy looking at the lake. And of course, now they are sending their sewage also into this lake, which is supplying drinking water to Pune. All of this is happening. Now, it is not a question of number of people. People are being displaced, deprived of their livelihoods to create like whatever conspicuous consumption for a small number. So those are the kind of issues which one has to talk about. Simply thinking of growing population and problem it poses, yes, but there are then all these much more concrete issues which one has to think of, I feel.
I think he gave a very good example of somebody asked the question of dhaba versus, the what do you call the mall style. Well, even in walking, you have now got an example from Professor Gadgil about to exercise the mall way and to exercise the dhaba way, And I think it can be very largely extended to many other things and so on. I think on this question of pressure of population, I am not a conspiratorial theorist or anything like that. But it is, I don't mean it's an exaggerated fear, but it is given the distribution of income and wealth in the world, where, well, I would not go into the statistics, given the distribution of which is extremely unequal, and on all evidence, this has kept on increasing in the last 100 years. Somebody who asked, the American Economic Review published papers on income distribution, whatever data is available over the last 100 years. It has systematically, inequality has increased. In this sort of a situation, I think probably, I should be a little bit more careful. Statistically speaking, I do not know which one would turn out to be statistically more important as a factor, but inequality probably contributes more to the maldistribution and the pressure on the ecology of the world than the population pressure. Both contribute, but the relative weight is probably much more because of the inequality. Thank you.
Yeah, there's a question it says, is modern development dependent on the creation or transformation of natural capital into a tradable asset that inherent in itself creates the barrier to full employment? There's also some corollaries. One is that is it the failure of government participation in market activities that results in natural resources going to private enterprises, extracting them more freely? And there's one also asking if modernization and urbanization is said to be associated with higher levels of productivity. How do we increase productivity along with, say, more appropriate production of goods in capital in rural areas. So they're not exactly related to one another, but I think you take this one.
Well, you see, take a very simple thing. One person, say in a factory, produces 10. One person living in a village produces 2. Okay? Now, if you take the same person or a similar person in the city, he will be producing 10 units or 10 goods, and in the village, he will be producing 1. Right? So you will actually require 10 people in the villages to produce this and 1 person in the city to produce this. This is higher productivity. The Tata Steel, to give you one concrete example to make the thing practical. Tata Steel, from the data which was collected by the Financial Times in London, and then has been made famous by people like us, the Tata Steel, in about 15 years' time, till the end of 2000, late 1990s, up to when the statistics is available, Tata Steel doubled its output. No, made its output 5 times more and reduced employment to half. Yes. And this is true of Maruti, where a big thing is going on about employment and strikes and so on now, right now, in Gurgaon and around Delhi and so on. That is, you had a 10-fold increase in output per head with half the population. And this is a story. I mean, I could tell you, then I started looking at it, what we vaguely say about mechanization, employment and so on. It is really true of Kirloskar, it is true of Bajaj, it is true of, I can give you the names, rattle out the names. The interesting thing is, if you do this, and this is not only in India, but this is in Europe today, in the grip of it. If you do this, there are 2 ways in which you can solve the problem. If you look at it as a kind of arithmetic. Either your market expands so much that you can produce output 10 times more or 5 times more, and you have such a large and expanding market, it absorbs it. Okay? This is one way of doing it. This is the Manmohan Singh, Montek Singh, that kind of, you go to the Planning Commission even today, before the board sings for them, and the other board of Modi begins to sing. You can go and you can find out exactly this from all of them. That they will say it with more jargon and so on than me, but this is what they would say is what we need. And where would we sell this output? We'll sell it abroad. We'll sell it in the external market. This is globalization. We de-emphasize local market, we emphasize international market. The problem with that is this requires technology which should be of an international standard. This is also, by the way, China's problem. But China has, I think, is beginning to learn a little bit more. That we want to sell it in the external market, and in the external market you require more technology. Now that technology would require even more natural resources, would be even more labor displacing, so on and so forth, because it has to internationally compete. Now, this productivity-focused notion of efficiency is something which is not only I don't accept, but this, some of you might even know the name because he writes regularly in New York Times and American papers, got a Nobel Prize and so on, Krugman. Krugman also wrote a paper which was not economics, a popular paper, the dangerous obsession, that increasing productivity to corporations. Is this what we want? Take a concrete case. Is this what we want, that we want very expensive, large godowns where you will store grains or, and then carefully give it out to whatever on some basis, and some of these grains would get spoiled like in India every year and so on. And you will spend this enormous so that the productivity is very high, and if the purchasing power is not very much, you store it to a larger and larger quantity, like with Indian grains it's a story, and then distribute it carefully. Is this what we want? Or do we want a situation where, for example, I'm giving you a simple example so that you can see it, where we have lots of local godowns which cannot store for more than, 1 year, 1.5 years, but a little bit, which exists in some parts, and where, because it is local, you can give it out much more easily depending on local needs. And if not, you can transport it. And this is something which, for example, I do not see why we cannot do it. The only reason why we cannot do it is because there is a sugar lobby, there is a grains lobby, there is a rich farmers lobby, and there are lobbies and lobbies and lobbies, and underground, overground, through the politicians, without the politicians. But to talk of development, like to talk of ecology, one of the part is, I would call a spade, one of the part is politics. Not only their politics, but their politics versus our politics. People who want a people-oriented development versus people who want a big business-oriented development, a lobby-oriented development. I will put my cards straight on the table that you don't have intellectual solutions to this problem beyond a point. I know what to do and how to make the country and the situation, better for poorer people, without even making it much worse. Worse, but not much worse for corporations than it is today. I mean, they will not prosper, but it will not be that they will be hanged. And this is something which you cannot, the model of development which we have got in would not allow that. Because if you want only growth, no employment, no participation of the people, so on and so forth, you cannot go beyond that.
There is this question here about contradictions between the people. How do you resolve the conflict between agricultural settlement in parts of the Western Ghats and the ecological concerns of environmentalists?
Well, I mean, there is, I do not take the view that environmental concerns are to be viewed such that any human intervention is to be avoided, whether it is agricultural or in terms of industrial development. One has to look at the context and work out what is possible. Now, there is a great deal of debate going on in Kerala, where in the before 1950s, I guess, much of that area, the forested hill areas, were highly malarial. And with the beginning of the malaria eradication campaign in the late 1950s, malaria was eradicated and many people came, settled and developed horticulture, other livelihoods in those hill areas. Whether they should be permitted today to continue, not continue, and all this debate is going on. The question is, as Amit was saying, practically given the situation today, what is it that we want to happen? And now the conflict is not really between whether in the 50s and 60s these people should have been allowed to encroach on forest and start cultivation. But today, most of these people are worried about the stone quarries destroying their livelihoods currently. And so these are the issues which I personally do not have any faith in experts and giving all answers. Experts, of course, are also as much subject to temptation and corruption as anybody else. I mean, I have looked at all the environmental impact assessments prepared by supposedly expert for large number of Goa mines. They are full of deliberate falsifications. So let's not say that we are experts and we are giving answers. As Amit said, that let the answers evolve from a broad participatory process. And since I have certainly very long experience over the years that the health of natural resource base locally is very important for the people. If we have a broader participatory decision making, pro-environment decisions are very likely to be taken much of the time. And I think this is what we should be thinking of. And I certainly am certainly very much against saying that I am an expert and I will tell what we should do on the Western Ghats or anywhere else. We can suggest what the process of arriving at appropriate decisions should be, not what specific decisions should be.
Would you like to, can I just ask one thing? And that is something which comes back over and over again in different forms. When you talk about the way in which more voices of ordinary people can be heard and so on, there is one question which you have to ask, which is the market is also a process there. And the other, if you extend the market, also through the market you hear voices. So where does the catch lie? Why is it that hearing the voices only through the market makes it difficult, particularly in a democracy, to accept? The answer is also very simple, because in a democracy, one adult, one vote. So a poor man has just one vote, just like Mr. Ambani has one vote. Okay? I mean, technically speaking, as a political. If you look at the money power, dollar, Mr. Ambani certainly has many more dollars than, or many more rupees than an ordinary Indian citizen. So the basic difference between the market is that the market votes with its currency or purchasing power. And in a democracy of, what shall I say, political democracy, you vote with one person, one vote. And this is why to register only what is good and what is bad, what is acceptable and what is not acceptable, only through the market is just like not listening to the market. We know some of the problems from Eastern Europe, but listening only to the market or thinking, giving some sort of a paramount importance to the market, which actually is 1 rupee, 1 vote. So if you have many rupees, you have many votes, versus 1 adult, 1 vote. These two systems, you must find some other system, at least at the local level, where this is done. And much of the notion of corruption and so on, if you really look at it as a serious problem in whatever the subject is, political science or philosophy, whatever it is, economic sociology, whatever is the name you give. If you look at the issue of corruption seriously, this is one of the root causes of corruption. And why we talk so much about corruption in democracies. You would not talk about corruption in a really totalitarian system, one-party system. Well, that man, the dictator takes everything, but the dictator takes everything because that's what dictatorship is supposed to be. The problem arises when you say, even in China, people talk about corruption, but that's about, well, anyway. This is why I think it is very important that if we believe in kind of democratic functioning, it is not only on the, I mean, if everybody had equal income, it would not be a problem. Since everybody do not have an equal income, we must find other, what you call processes, mechanisms, regulations, whatever it is, by which the non-market voices can be heard.
This is a slightly different question. The government of India has mandated CSR as a percentage of profit for all corporates starting April 1st. So the problem with this is that companies have an investor base usually very far away from their base of operations. How can this benefit, and is there a way in which this can be made to benefit the people in the areas where the companies operate rather than generally?
I would just quote one concrete example. There is a power production, coal-based power production plant in Ratnagiri district of Maharashtra, in Konkan, where the factory owner has forcibly taken over the estuary next to the factory is on a hillock, on a plateau, the estuary next to it, to bring in coal to supply the power plant. And the fairly prosperous fishing community, which was earlier operating in that area now cannot use that estuary at all, and they have serious problems how to conduct their fishing operations, which were for perhaps generations dependent on access to all of that. Now I went both to the factory and talked to them, and then I went to this village of fishermen, and we were talking, and the fishing women said that the corporate social responsibility activity of this factory is to run tailoring classes for us. They said, we want to eat fish and sell fish. Who the hell wants to stitch clothes? So this CSR makes no sense. If they want to show some corporate social responsibility, they should stop blocking the fishermen from using the estuary.
Well, I don't want to, but you know this, the problem which he gave a concrete example. There are so many examples of this kind when you come to land. Because repeatedly, many parts of India, and some of these parts I have traveled with well-known so-called activists in land acquisition process and so on and so forth, like Madhav and so on. One of the problems which comes up over and over again in their area, in other areas, so on and so forth, is a very simple one, that we want land for land. Why? Compensation. We don't want money, we want land for land. The same reason. Who the hell wants to live in your city, in a slum, if you give me, 30 lakhs or 50 lakhs? I would much rather have my lifestyle more or less continued. Just like a professor, I mean, if you are a real professor, you may be good for nothing, actually, for the society. But at the same time, one of the lifestyles, if they allow you to permit, you don't want to change even if you get much more money, And this is something which is true of many, many people, and it's not one example and so on. It's a very big problem of land acquisition. How much you can solve it by financial compensation. And it comes up over and over again.
There's a question about education. How important is education to livelihood and employment in the context of development? And second thing is, natural resource development must go hand in hand with human resource development through quality education, autonomy of the university, and question about political interference in educational matters, should it be entertained? So, yeah.
Again, concrete experiences make more sense to me. Now we have a Forest Rights Act. The whole thing is traditional forest, scheduled tribes and traditional forest dwellers' rights over the Forest Act. And as per this act, people are expected to be given land for cultivation if they have been cultivating it, but more importantly, community forest resources where they can then use the local resources. Throughout the country, there is a serious attempt to sabotage application of this act, including in Goa, by the way. I tried for 2-3 years when I happened to be member of National Advisory Council. So there was some clout, and Mrs. Sonia Gandhi wrote to the then Chief Minister, and there were endless rounds of discussions, but nothing has been done here in Goa about implementation of these Forest Rights Act and community forest rights. But because there has been a good leadership amongst the local people in Gadgil district of Maharashtra, substantial number of villages, they have been given community forest rights. Now they have important resources to handle and manage, and there is substantial income possible, because bamboo, for example, bamboo now has large market and can be a very valuable resource. It was being given, as I was mentioning in the other example, essentially free to the paper mill. Now people have that bamboo and they have to manage it. And so there is a whole lot of things to be done, technical, managerial, and the young people are very interested in acquiring the appropriate knowledge. I had an example, they are all failing in 10th standard in mathematics. But now they want to know how much bamboo they have and how long the bamboos are, because the price that they are getting, the village community is getting, is dependent on how long the bamboo is. And so we were measuring bamboo in the forest, and you use simple trigonometry. And they had suddenly become interested in sine and cos, and they want to learn the geometry. And they have, yes, because then they can properly conduct. So there is a tremendous difference, and now they suddenly want to be able to use computers and use tally and make, keep accounts, and these are all young boys and girls who have failed 10 standards, but they are picking it up. So if there is some context value for that knowledge, then there is a tremendous interest I am seeing on their part. When this context was not there, they had no rights over these resources, and they really had no, though the really future the young people saw for themselves, they were completely disinterested in what they were being taught. So I think it is at these levels it is important. I do not know about autonomy to the universities and so on, that's at a separate level, but this I have been seeing in last few years in Gadgil district. So yes, and in particular, again, this whole local self-employment and so on, so much of it has come because now they have control over those resources. And throughout the country, there is a tremendous potential of being given these communities control over their community forest resources, and a whole series of employment opportunities opening up, which is being systematically denied, primarily because of the vested interests of the mining lobby who want to get this land.
Yes,
I mean, this I agree, and I could add, the famous example of brooms in Orissa, where they won the fight, basically women won the fight on having the forest right to take brooms and sell it in the market. Earlier they were not allowed, because of the forest rights and so on, in large parts of Orissa. But rather than giving another example, I think, you see, education, because we all hear and we all happen to be in some way connected with education and so on, is very, talk about it. One extremely important economic thing about education is not what is the return and the usual kind of stuff, whether, they really produce more people who are educated and so on. But a very simple question, which I also said earlier, and this is, if you educate people, it is related to it, but a little bit more, I think, rather than a particular example, that if you educate people in a certain way which is not their context, it becomes like, this is not my example, the example of somebody whom I admire very much. As a matter of fact, one of the few economists I admire very much of the traditional variety who, well, he also got a Nobel Prize some years ago and is dead now. What he said is that, higher education, better health, all these things as a qualification for employment. If you don't create more employment, if you don't create more livelihood, this is like having a long queue and you bring some people in front of the queue because they are whatever it is. They are taller, or some people are fairer, or some people are darker. You pick out some people and you put them in front for a qualification which actually is not in your context. If somebody was, unless he was exceptional, whether somebody passed school or not, if he cannot go out of that area to another context, what difference does it make? And this is what repeatedly many people say in the peasant areas, that why should we learn and so on. And this is where you must remember that whoever asked the question, that just like employment, it is not only producing goods, it is also what use will be made of it, not by you, but by the wider community market, whatever you say. And similarly with education, it is, if you do not do education, or if you only say that I will make more universities. Since we are in a university, let's say, I'll make more universities, or I'll make more engineering college and management schools, whatever it is. Apart from good, bad, anything that is, I think there is a basic catch in this. That is, do you have the corresponding thing to produce it? Or would you be like an IIT computer science department or an JNU mathematical economics department? You simply produce people who will go abroad to become professors there. You know, is this the market we are trying to cater to? If not, our education has to be more context oriented. Not only in the dramatic sense of bamboo and the very poor area, but even in the cities. What do you do with a BA, MA degree if your job prospect doesn't improve? You know, and what you do today, you say that to be a peon, you require to be an MA, like in places like West Bengal. You know, recently I was told that you have to have an MA degree to qualify for certain kind of jobs to carry the envelope and read the name. Oh, there is a joke. No, but it's true. I'm not, you know, because you create this supply because you give the middle class aspiration without deciding how it will be used. You know? And this is always, remember this very simple fact about education, that you cannot improve the education system simply by making it context free, except for very bright people or a few people who can get out of that context, accidentally or otherwise.
We're taking only two more questions. One is a very interesting question. It says, you know, we've talked a lot about mining and its negative impacts. It says, is there a difference in the way that mining is done in developing countries and in developed countries? Can technology mitigate the negative effects of mining? Why is it that mining is such an issue mainly in developing countries rather than developed countries?
My understanding is the following, that in Sweden, for example, there is a lot of mining. It is carried out in very much more careful fashion and in environmentally and socially far less disturbing fashion. This is my understanding. Germany is an industrially advanced country. Well, let me take this concrete example because I find it easier to talk about concrete things. Rhine was once a very polluted river, maybe like this Vashishti river I was talking about from the chemical industry in the Ratnagiri district. The Germans made sure that the industry had to become responsible, really genuinely undertake pollution control, and Rhine now is a very clean river with very stocked fish stocks and so on. Anyway, so it is fully recovered. I have German friends who told me why this is so. They said the logic is more or less clear. In Germany, the industrialists are willing to accept whatever 6, 7, 8% return on the capital invested. In India, the capitalists want whatever 7,000, 20,000% return on 100 rupees invested. In Goa, we have an official report, 35,000 crores of illegal profits. Now, when you are so continually absorbed in attempting to make these illegal profits, which is easy enough because you have a corrupt administrative political system that you don't give a damn for destroying the environment, for doing injustice to the people, then mining is a problem. Now, if you have a society like Germany or Sweden, where you cannot get away with any of this, and where you are not going to make, in fact, one of the miners told me, obscene levels of profit, but modest levels of profit, then problems will disappear. I do not know, this may sound very simplistic, but Amit, this is the kind of scenario which I understand prevails.
I think for once there is a little bit of, not disagreement, but I think there is, I notice a little bit of over-optimism on the part of my friend, Professor Madhav Gadgil, which is probably not totally founded. Because it is true but for two reasons. One is historical, I did not go into it, that much of the mining, much of the things which he's talking about, Sweden, Norway, well, anyway, there was a phase by which much of this is taken from other countries, so on and so forth. If you have either money or classical, what was called imperialism and so on, you should not forget about that part. And whether this is and what China is trying to repeat to a certain extent, and India is trying to repeat to a certain extent. I mean, whether this is something, that pattern of industrialization with that kind of mining today in India is possible without very vastly creating other kind of problem, is a very doubtful proposition. I think, it is not only a technological issue, but I'll give you an opposite example and much closer to what I was saying, that it is not only a question of what, in one word, what Madhav was saying is a regulation issue. That if you can make the regulation work, then to a certain extent you can overcome the problem. I think yes, on some scale, in the case of extreme illegal minings and absurdly destroying the nature and so on, this is certainly true. But let me give you the example, since he gave, I will also give an example from the world. For quite some time, regularly I used to, like I come to Goa a little bit more, I used to teach in Norway and Sweden. And in the process, because these are the ideal cases of so-called social democratic countries, that was one of the reasons I was interested in taking that job. One of the very interesting things I noticed was about their hydropower in Norway, which is a huge, they have these waterfalls and so on. And then I asked a Norwegian professor friend, and through him I got something translated, read the literature. They had a completely different solution to the problem, which is not a regulation solution, but which is based on the local population. These are a bit like Goa, because they had separate communities with waterfalls and so on in different areas. They said, all right, what does a community vote? In most areas, the community said, it so happened in this particular example I'm giving, most of the community said, we want the hydroelectric power. Because they're separate communities, we want 24-hour electricity at cheap, relatively cheap and so on, they agreed. 3 or 4, I've forgotten, a small number of communities said, we do not want it. We are against it. And it was, after the second round, it was agreed that every community will have its veto power. So what do? That you change the design to make it separate, smaller designs for the communities which said yes, and for the rather than one big with long carriage and so on. And the answer was, well, if you have voted against it till for 5 to 7 years or whatever the time period was, I have forgotten, you will not, but you will also not get cheaper hydroelectric power. Okay? And there was a similar story in Sweden, I would not say. This is one way of dealing with some of the sensitive natural resource problems. Again, it depends on the context where the solution would work. But I know this happened in Norway, and the opposite happened for a similar reason in Sweden. The project failed, but that's too long. And this is one way of solving the problem, not regulation from above. I think that's a very, if I may say so, Germanic solution, having known the country. That's a very Germanic solution to the problem. I think there is a better solution, at least to try, in the case of natural resources and so on.
Last question is about the Madhav project. I'm sure you're aware of it. I think it's basically asking what is your opinion on what are the consequences for Goa. So, there is a project on a river called the Madhav, which flows through the way Karnataka wants to dam it and divert the water into another river that is flowing towards, this is a west flowing river. They want to divert it into a east flowing river, the water.
No, I do not know any details of the Madhav River or the Mandavi downstream of Madhav and exactly what the project is. So I am not in a position to answer, except to say that I would like that river to remain healthy. My granddaughter is named Mandavi.
But I think apart from the river, particular project and so on, again, this is a very good example, if you like, including a kind of, you can set it up even as a game theoretic example, is a very good example of how to try popular participation in all these, between state rivers. All right, you will get so much water. You negotiate that if you agree, you and I agree, we'll get so much water. But if we don't agree, all right, the river will not be constructed, or it will be only constructed on one side, or whatever, it is a smaller project, where it is feasible, but you will not get anything out of it. And this is the only, this is not the only way, but this is an important way in which some of the almost interminable problems between states, between India and Bangladesh, on Tista, between India and Pakistan, if you have goodwill, you can try. Now again, in Norway they had the goodwill. Here I am not sure.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Professor Gadgil. Thank you, Professor Bhaduri.